Okay. Oh, is the mic on?
Yes.
Yeah, it is. Thanks. Perfect.
Members, this is file item 9.
So I'll go through the general items on the lead scientist report first of all. Before I do that, I thought I would just let you know that our next Delta Science Programs brown bag will be on March the 5th, and the title will be Unifying Aquatic Science for Adaptive Management of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, that will be given by Dr. Erwin van Nieuwenhausen from the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. And for those of you who know Erwin, he'll give a very entertaining talk linking a little of the history with ecology, adaptive management, and some of the relevance of that to the Delta. So you'll be getting the formal announcement on that, but just to mark your calendars. The first item that's on here, we just wanted to let you know that the CARVA seminar that we held back in January on what is a natural hydrograph in regulated rivers, that seminar is now online, so you can go to the UC Davis CARVA webpage and page your way through that for some of the presentations. I thought just a couple of the presentations you might be particularly interested in. The State Water Resources Control Board were very interested to have some of their staff give one of the lectures on that, because the item this afternoon, that's exactly the problem that they've been grappling with. Mm-hmm. So they gave a very interesting perspective from the science that they're considering in some of their deliberations. I would also point you to Dr. Pat's lecture, not only his keynote lecture he kicked off, but he also had some pretty entertaining comments throughout the day, particularly for the panel discussion in the afternoon. I'd also like to just acknowledge Chris Enright of our staff who put this together, and one of his ideas was to engage an early career researcher scientist to help with him in the organization. And Sarah Yarnell, not only did she give a great talk, but she and Chris are actually leading the peer-reviewed journal article which we're putting together as an outcome from those discussions. And Sarah's just doing a great job, and I think this generation of being able to look across interdisciplinary science in a way that we're not so good at is just really great. So watch for that draft publication coming out in the next few weeks. She's also very good at cracking the whip. The second item here is something we put on more as an experiment. I'd like to thank Emily Mortazavi, who is one of our state fellows who helped us put this together. But we thought it might be interesting when you're, for some of you drifting in and out with all of your other responsibilities, just have a quick visual of what's really going on in the Delta. What are the conditions right now? What are some of the big issues? And so this sheet that Emily put together is really a snapshot of some of the key indicators which are driving decisions going on the Delta issues right now. And to highlight a few of these, you already heard from Mr. Knopp about the issues facing the Delta smelt and the take at the pumps. On this sheet, we'd just like to point out there is a typo. The current smelt salvage total is 228. There was actually a misposting when we put this together, and the corrected value is 228. Also in that box, you can see the current inflow, Clifton Court inflow, and the Jones pumping plant extracts that are being taken out at the moment. And beneath that, we've given you the 4-year February average. So you can see that what's actually being diverted currently is considerably lower than has been the norm in the past few years. A couple of the other statistics here, it's been a little bit, in fact we were talking just before the meeting started about is there such a thing as a normal year anymore. Currently the snowpack in the Sierra is at 88% of normal or of average. And it's been a little bit of a strange year. We had a lot of precipitation through December. We then had an extended dry period and then a pretty big storm in the last few days. There's a difference between what's going on in the northern part of the Sierra and the southern part of the Sierra. The northern Sierra is slightly above the average, and in the southern Sierra it's less than that. And then Emily also included here a couple of statistics about where the storage sits right now. And based on Mr. Merrill's or Dr. Merrill's presentation earlier, you can see that's reflected in these figures. So the Oroville current storage is 113% of the normal value at this point. Shasta is also above the normal. And those two reservoirs together combine to be about 50% of the storage in the north of Delta. What we see further south is that we're considerably below normal, about 70% of what San Luis Reservoir would actually have. So that just gives you a snapshot. Together with that, we've got all of the web links that you can go to if you want more of those statistics. But if you find that useful just to track from meeting to meeting, we'd be very willing to maintain that.
I'll just speak for myself. I like this kind of summary of information. We normally get an occasional periodic news story with either drought ended or drought started headlines. So and this is a useful way of getting a picture image, just a suggestion. You might post it easily available on our website, keep it updated, say on a weekly basis, because this is useful information.
Okay, that's great. And then we'll give the web links, so if people want more information, you can go and see the time series and things like that.
I would concur. I think that, again, it's a summation of different information that's out there, but I think it's a good effort, and I would encourage us to continue to do that.
Okay, thank you. The last two items before we step into the science plan is we obviously try and keep you abreast of some of the thinking and research and important science which is coming out on the Delta. So these two next items, the first one we put on here, one, it's been a very interesting scientific program going back almost 10 years, and it's particularly in response to Mr. Fiorini's comments when we were talking about the science plan before, and your comments in the town hall meeting about this need to be thinking about these models that can cross different areas. How do you connect, for example? I think your example was sort of flows, habitat, and fish. So the Delta Ecological Flows tool has been a model that's been developed very much along those lines. And the model developers and the Nature Conservancy and several of the agencies that have helped support this ran a series of meetings and workshops during January, really for a variety of purposes. One, it was to the high level of the agencies to show that this tool is now out there and available. It went through managers, and then they also held a workshop for a day where they painstakingly went through all of the assumptions that go into the model. And these assumptions are published. It's about a 200-page document where they were looking for input. How can the model be improved? So essentially this is an advance on some of the conceptual models that have been out there. And it's trying to understand the connections between flows, habitat, and focal species of fish in particular. So we gave you the web page there. The program's been developed by ESSA out of British Columbia, who are very highly regarded in the ecological world. They do a lot of work actually throughout the world, the Columbia Basin and down here. So I'm not sure, are there any further questions or thoughts on that tool?
Randy? No.
Yeah.
It's good.
And I also wanted to update you on the UCLA research program. And I was a little curious about this. If you recall, this was the group that came up.
They were shaking the levees.
They were shaking the levees, and it got a lot of press, and they were surprised that the levees hadn't failed. And even in the engineering literature, I think some of the goals of that study had been you misinterpreted. So we had an opportunity about 2 weeks ago to meet with the UCLA research team when they were up here in Sacramento. And with their permission, I'm just giving a very brief update of their research program, which is actually very impressive. The research team is led by Professor Brandenburg and Professor Stewart, who are respectively the chair and the vice chair of the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at UCLA. And what was particularly impressive about their research is that they're really spanning a very broad scope. So they're dealing with everything from the very fundamental soils property under seismic loading, almost at the microscopic scale, with some of their research. And then on the other scale, they're looking at how river levees on a very large scale may respond to earthquake shaking. Very, very practical. So to start at the larger scale issue, they've got funding actually from many sources from state agencies. They're also part of the National Science Foundation's major initiative on the Network for Earthquake Engineering Simulation, what's known as the NEES initiative. So they're connected to the national effort there. On the broad scale, NEES has had some nice connections with Japan. And Japan has probably the most sophisticated hazards research institute in the world. So they had very good instrumentation on many of their levees at the time of the earthquakes in 2004 and 2007. So researchers, Professor Ray Seed at UC Berkeley and the UCLA group, got some funding to go and do an assessment of the performance of the levees in Japan and what lessons could be transferred from the Japanese experience to help California be better prepared for our inevitable earthquakes and levees. So that program is ongoing. Going right to the other end of the scale and the experiments which had been undertaken, the goal of that research program was less to look at how may individual levees respond under earthquake loading, because they said, well, we fully understood that if a levee had been drained because there was no water against it, when you take the water out, it compresses, it becomes much stronger. What their research was really focused on is how do the peat soils respond beneath the levees. So they said, yes, it's very important, these individual levee failures, but if you were really to shake the delta in general, most of that's on these underlying peat soils. And so they've been undertaking field tests and laboratory tests using some very sophisticated technologies to understand that. And what's interesting, they said there's virtually nothing in the peer-reviewed literature about peat behavior. And without going into all of the details, what they're finding is that this process under normal soils, which would really be of secondary importance, on peat soils could become quite significant. So they're just working on the first paper to come out of that research, and so we immediately said, well, as soon as that's submitted, will you come and give us a brown bag seminar, because there'll be a lot of interest, and they've agreed to do that. So probably in the next few months, we'll have the UCLA team up here, and they'll give a brown bag here in this room.
Was the concern, Peter, that the soil beneath the levees would liquefy? And would peat tend to liquefy sooner or easier than normal type soil?
Well, actually, what the concern is, and it's very interesting with peat soils, what happens when you shake a soil that's saturated, it builds up the pore water pressure, the water pressure's inside. And as that water pressure relieves itself, that's when you can get slumping and other failures. That's a classic way of looking at things. What they've determined is that with the peat soils here, yes, the soils are pretty impervious vertically, but laterally they've got very high permeabilities. So the normal shaking that you would expect to see is perhaps less important because that pore pressure can dissipate quite quickly. That's in the literature. What they're looking at is what would then happen. How does that soil respond after shaking, not immediately, but over the following months? And that's the process that they're honing in on. So there the consequences could be, would you see widespread settlement of the levees, not the failure at an individual point, but could we see some sort of reduction in in the levee heights over a large area as a result of these processes. So that's what the research question that they were focused on. It wasn't necessarily the failure of an individual levee. And that's where their research sits, and they're still working through a lot of the data. So they've still got some scenarios to do in the laboratory.
Do we have any indication that peat will behave differently, have a higher or a lower failure rate immediately at the time of the shock?
Immediately, and this is a little bit out of my area, the risk of failure is absolutely still there. And as they pointed out, when you've got a lot of heterogeneity in the levee material, you've got structures on levees, the risk of failure, maybe where you've got a structure right next to material, that's a very localized risk assessment to do. So they weren't looking at that. That risk is still out there. It's really not what their research was focused on. What they're looking at is that if you were to shake the entire delta, rather than a catastrophic failure, would it mean that maybe levees which we've just built up may then be substandard? I think that would be one of the potential consequences.
Yeah, I guess I'm more interested in the immediate failure and whether the specific soil, the peat and the delta, makes it more susceptible or less susceptible to failure. We don't know the answer to that. We're assuming it's the same?
Because it's under peat.
Or over peat.
Or over peat. Yeah, I think there's clearly quite a lot of resilience when you have an earth structure over other things. For example, concrete structure is something that's very rigid. Whereas when you're dealing with soils, unless you get liquefaction, as you pointed out, beneath it, which could result in a catastrophic failure with those soils, it's unlikely that the peat soils themselves would cause massive failure at the foundation level. I think it's more this secondary process which is going to be critical.
So the peat may be able to dissipate.
To absorb some of that shock, yeah.
The way the buildings in Japan are designed to take the stress at the middle of the building, halfway up to the top.
Right.
As opposed to at the very top where it would be amplified.
Where it flicks, yeah. Okay, but anyway, more on that, and for the professors, I hope I didn't misspeak on their early comments, but I think it's just very good that you're some of the best minds in seismic engineering in the geotechnical area are actually focusing their research here on the delta. Okay, if there are no more questions on that, what I'd like to do is just shift and get your thoughts on where we are with the science plan update. And before I jump into this, I would like to just talk a little bit about the process which you were going through with the science plan. And we have received several questions, particularly in the last 2 or 3 weeks, from folks saying, how can we contribute to the science plan? We're very interested. We have things to offer. And our response is that clearly you as the council are totally committed to openness and transparency in everything you do. And the Delta Science Program, we absolutely want to be that way as well. But at the same time, you've made it clear that time is of the essence, and there's so many big decisions being made right now you're on science and how science fits into many of the big programs, that it's important to have something out there so that where the council's going, where the Delta plan is going, and where the science fits together to support that. So what we've been doing is engaging very heavily with many of the ongoing processes, the State Water Quality Control Board, the USGS, IEP, water contractors, the TNC. They have held a series of meetings. And obviously things are extremely complex. So what our idea has been is to put together as quickly as possible a discussion document and a draft plan, taking in what we're picking up from all of these other programs which are going on. And right now, today, we'd like to talk just a little bit about the organizing science, which is the really obviously an important point here. How do you actually conduct the business of science in the Delta? And then if it can be squeezed in the March meeting, we'd like to come back and talk at a similar level of all of the other elements which go into the science plan. And if you feel comfortable with where the plan's going, what we would like to do is to have this discussion draft out so people can engage and comment on the principles and what the science plan is actually saying. By April, early April, the reason for doing that is that many of the big science conferences which happen on the Bay Delta systems either occur in the spring or in the fall. And the reason for that is because there's so much monitoring and science goes on over the summer months. So we would like to capture that window where there's a series of forums, scientific meetings and conferences where we can engage with the science community. And of course there'll be many other forums related to management and things like that. But there's an opportunity where we can actually have direct engagement in those meetings and get feedback. We can have posters and so on. So that's where we sit right now. What we're trying to do with this science plan is it needs to be something which is going to be useful. It's going to work across all of these different programs. So what you're going to see in the science program is we're not going to be suggesting that there's a single science agency created that does all of the science. What we've been looking at is how can you work across different programs to get to the sort of issues which you're raising. How do you actually understand how this complex system functions? And related to that, before we actually get into the presentation itself, is I must say I feel quite optimistic about this. I think whether you're talking to BDCP, whether it's the remand process, whether it's some of the very in-depth planning that IEP has been doing to make the science relevant to these issues, the overarching sentiment behind this is collaborative science. How can we do collaborative science better? And so, because there is this common move to unite the science community, there's a lot of things in here that I think people say, yes, this is just going to make sense. So, let's see, maybe if we can go to these few PowerPoint slides. So within this, just to hit the conclusions first of all, I'm going to talk briefly about how do you strengthen the science infrastructure, and I'll define what we mean by science infrastructure in a moment. But this is essentially the value-added things which, if we put it in place, we could conduct the business of science much more efficiently. Whether it's monitoring, whether it's data management, whether it's getting access to the same models. The second thing we're going to suggest is the creation of a high-level policy science team. And Mr. Fiorini will recognize this as one of the things which came out very strongly in the town hall meeting. The third part of this is how do you strengthen science management interfaces? Already there's really great models that it's possible to build on, but at the same time, often the science that's feeding that management is necessarily limited because there's a specific science program that's feeding information to that entity. It's not capturing the full body of science that's out there. And the fourth part, what we're suggesting that you consider is the construction of this or establishment of a Delta Science synthesis team. And how do you actually facilitate these synthesis activities? If you recall the National Research Council, that was one of the main messages that they delivered that is currently absent in the system. And if we take a look at this outline, this is a very brief summary of what you commented on last time and gave us some very positive suggestions of what the science plan outline is going to look like. So if we break that down, there's many issues which we'd like to come back and cover in the next meeting: the science to inform adaptive management and the strategies and approaches for building the best available science. Of course, those are the two cornerstones of what we're trying to do. But in this presentation, what we'd like is your feedback on the two issues. One is, how do we actually organize science better to achieve outcomes? And how do we transform the science policy management interface? So what do we mean by science infrastructure? This is what we want to put in place to accelerate knowledge discovery, to make it easier for scientists to do their jobs, and that means providing them more time for fundamental thinking, and building this concept of a science community, the One Delta, One Science. And I'd just like to clarify one thing from the discussion earlier. We fully recognize that what we mean by one science is not saying that all scientists are going to come out with the same opinion. I mean, if that was the case, it would slow up the knowledge discovery. What we want to do is have the forum where competing hypotheses, where competing ideas can be tested in a supportive environment. So where we don't understand things, there is a lot of uncertainty. How do you structure science across different programs in such a way that you can really encourage those disagreements and make these leaps forward, because that will accelerate what we understand and what we don't. So to do that in this process, we've given a lot of thought to the process for prioritizing research. How do you share models? I think the last time I explained some of the issues which everyone recognized very clearly, that even when people are using the same models, if you're using different input data sets, if you're using different scenarios, there are different conclusions going to come out of that model. So how can you give access to everyone to use those models? How do you train people to use those models? How do you allow people to access the output from those models? The third point here is there's some really great thinking going on, some very innovative thinking in areas about integrated monitoring approaches. The Water Quality Monitoring Council, for example, is really taking a hard look at this. Our task is to look at how we can build on those sorts of approaches, and how can you start moving data from water quality into other areas. And so that comes to the issue of data management and accessibility. Once you have that, what sort of process do you have to conduct the synthesis of scientific knowledge? What sort of independent scientific peer review should we have in place, or what range of opportunities and mechanisms for independent science review? And then how do you actually resolve scientific agreement? How do you identify where there are legitimate disagreements and begin to start resolving some of those? So what I'd like to talk about, first of all, is this science policy interface. And again, the quote here is from the NRC report from May last year, where they encourage the community here to explore how do you have a better collaborative effort where governance and science is better integrated. And so what we're suggesting here is the creation of a policy science team. And what that would look like without going through all of the details. This would be a very high-level team comprising of, on one side, directors, heads of agencies, and really the leaders on the policy side. And on the other side, there's a subset of leaders from the science community. This group would convene maybe twice a year. One of the suggestions we thought is that this could meet before or after the implementation committee, where you've already got many of the leaders from the agency directors' side committed. And the purpose of this policy science team would, from one side, it goes in two directions. From the policy side, it allows for example, a director to pose questions of the broad science community in a very safe forum. So one of the things we heard was that there's really great science within individual agencies, but often that science is geared towards one part of the question, which is related to the mission of that agency. When it gets to the director level, perhaps they're looking across a broader spectrum of issues. So this is an opportunity to have a frank exchange about what's known and what isn't. It also allows the science community to listen, and if you like, if they're generating the river of knowledge, how does their science programs, how does the conclusions support some of the really big questions which are facing the agency directors?
Peter, I haven't seen the slides, so I'm just responding. Yep. What decisions go to the policy science team? What authority is given to the team? Do they make decisions that control operations of either water supply or ecosystems, or is it simply an advisory body that kind of sits out there?
No, that's coming out later. No, this is purely looking at the science. So one of the functions of this group would be so with operations, no. There would perhaps be questions that would come up that are facing the operations team and the management decisions that you really need to know the depth and the breadth of the science on which they're going to base their decisions on.